Well, let's see what we've got happening in the news on this particular day. Well, one thing we've got happening is apparently members of the Freedom Caucus are attacking the proposed spending cuts in the debt ceiling bill, and they're calling it woefully inadequate and vowed to oppose the legislation when it hit the floor. We had the time to act, and this deal fails completely, is what Representative Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, and he is the chair of the Freedom Caucus, said on yesterday. We will do everything in our power to stop it and end it now. The House is expected to hold a final vote on the bill on Wednesday, while other members of the Freedom Caucus continue to denounce the compromise brokered by the Republican Speaker Kevin McCarthy and President Joe Biden over the weekend. So that is one of the things that we're seeing going on in the world and all in that space. The compromise bill, formerly named the Fiscal Responsibility Act, would suspend the debt ceiling until 2025, allowing the U.S. to avoid a default that they say could reap devastating consequences on the American economy. The Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, has warned that the federal government will be unable to pay its bills starting on June 5th unless Congress takes action. In addition to the debt ceiling suspension, the bill includes the government spending cuts and expanded work requirements demanded by McCarthy. This has been a lot of hard work and a lot of late nights that have gone into changing the spending trajectory in this town, according to Steve Scalise, the House Majority Leader, and he told reporters that on Tuesday night. For once in a long, long time, Washington is actually going to spend less money next year than it is this year, and that's a reform that all of us can support. So that's what's going on in that space. We're going to actually bring in our folks, including a presidential candidate, that being Lee Newton Rhodes, and see what he's got to say about that, and if he would be doing the same thing. And hopefully Sasha will be joining us, because the other thing that I was seeing in the news was that the war has come to the doorsteps of Moscow. That's right. The Ukrainians have had drones that struck Moscow, and definitely it'll be interesting to see what happens in that space, since apparently the drones have attacked Russian oil refineries, and they have definitely hit Moscow. And now we're going to see what kind of reaction that Putin has to the attack coming to his front door, literally, and all in that kind of way.
Good morning, Mark. I'm going to start with a question for you regarding the debt limit.
Yes.
Normally, you and I, if you spent $1,000 last year and $1,010 this year, you're going to say that your spending went up. But in government, sometimes, if you spend $1,000 last year and you were projected to spend $1,500 this year, but you whittle it down to $1,200, some would consider that you decreased your spending because you decreased what you were projected to spending. When government's talking now about reducing their spending, I wouldn't be so happy until I found out the details. Are they really reducing spending, or are they just reducing it from what they were projected to have spent? Well, so in other words, they're increasing spending, but not by as much as they thought they were.
It seems like they're increasing spending, but I had actually invited a guest that talks about fiscal responsibility. So we're actually going to get to him, and all along that space, he is actually coming to us from another part of the world. So I'm going to bring on Gurpreet Pata, and I hope that I pronounced his name correctly and all of that. But how are you doing, Mr. Pata? And what are some of your thoughts about fiscal responsibility? Because I know when we ran across each other on social media, that was one of your topics of interest, was fiscal responsibility and some other things along those lines. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about how the U.S. is doing and how the world is doing in this notion of fiscal responsibility.
I think that we're doing a very poor job. And so I have my background is to look at things in a system-wide manner. I have a finance degree in international business. And I think that the only reason that the U.S. has not collapsed utterly as in terms of our economics is that we have an exorbitant opportunity, I would say, the pleasure of printing dollars at will. And we're one of the few countries, because of our reserve status, that can generate money whenever we want. And because of that generation of money at will, we take advantage of it as a country. It's what England did for a while, and before them, it's what the Netherlands did. It's what, and before that, other countries have done the same thing. When they become the reserve currency, they get that exorbitant opportunity, and that's what we've done. And we're going to have to deal with it coming up very quickly.
But are you saying we're printing money out of thin air?
We are, absolutely.
I totally agree.
Yeah, I mean, if it only costs us, if our major export to the world is not oil, is not technology, it's not our brains, it's not our capacity, it's not our education. What do we export? We export $100 bills, and it's through the Saudi government that we had made a deal. Nixon's government made a deal with the Saudis to have them agree. It was actually Ike afterwards, but that they would use petrodollars to settle all transactions. And when petrodollars are no longer are not going to be the reserve, they're not going to be how we settle oil, then we've got a problem. And right now we've got a big problem, because a lot of people are going to accept the yuan as a way to settle their transactions.
Well, that's already happening, but in terms of the debt ceiling, in other words, with a bill in front of Congress.
Oh, if you're talking about that, that's a different story.
Different story. See, it's a different story compared to our macroeconomic issues that you're discussing. The micro issue before the House and the Senate is to raise the debt ceiling so that we will pay the bills that we've already incurred, otherwise default. It is totally irresponsible by some of the Republican Party and Democratic Party to oppose the bill. Totally
disagree, Nick.
Pardon?
I disagree.
Well, it's totally irresponsible. Okay, Lee, I'll tell you what. See, this may be where reasonable minds are different. You have no problem defaulting on your credit cards. I have a problem.
I never said default. You said default.
I like to keep my credit score high. You may not.
Me,
okay? So,
me too. There are other alternatives.
The Republicans and some Democrats are okay with defaulting on our obligations. I'm not. Okay, and there are a lot of people out there that will agree with
Nick,
and they're totally
Nick, in all due respect, why do you or others revert to default as the only option as opposed to increasing the debt limit? We have a thing called reducing spending, do we not?
Because if they want to do what they're proposing to do, the proper time to do it is not now. The proper time to do it was last year when the budget is passed, and this year when the 2024 budget is passed. What you're seeing right now by certain congressmen is totally irresponsible behavior on both parties. Okay? They're just totally irresponsible. If they want their message out, this is not the time to do it. When it comes, it's like saying this. Well, I disagree with my credit card bill, so I'm just not going to pay it. And so the Republicans that are doing this and the Democrats that are doing this should all be thrown out of Congress.
Nick, you brought up a credit card bill. You ever tried that with your credit card company? I'm sorry, hit the limit. Can you just increase it, please? You ever tried that? What do they say?
That's not what's happening. It's not we hit the limit, increase it. It's the credit card bill is due on the 25th. I want to wait and go ahead and default and pay the extra payment for a late payment, because you and I know they'll eventually make good on the American debt because of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. But in the meantime, they're going to be hit with extra charges. Now, you and I may differ. You may say, I don't mind the extra charges because it's the principle of the thing. I do mind the extra charges. Okay.
Isn't there a lot of the spending discretionary? I couldn't think of a word. Discretionary spending that you can just cut.
The proper time to do it is when the budget's passed. It's not after the budget's passed and we changed our mind. And we have a new budget.
You think they're going to cut it once they get what they want?
No, there's a process. The debt limit. There's the appropriations process where they decide and discuss what they're going to pay for. Then at the end of the year, after the bill comes due, that's where the debt limit comes into play. So the actual time that you're talking about, Lee, is during the appropriations process where they decide and make deals on particular things. So right now, what Nick is talking about is spot on.
But
they've already spent
time. I actually agree with Jatovy. Okay, the right time is the budget process time.
Yeah, that's the appropriation.
Not when the bill is due. It's when you made the decision to spend the money, which is the budget process. And there's a 2024 budget being passed around right now. If they want to clamp down on that, more power to them. But please don't say a budget that you agreed to in Congress. Granted, you are not the controlling group in Congress. And you're going to say, well, I changed my mind. I'm just not going to pay my bill.
And what makes it even more irresponsible,
thrown out of office. Like
what makes it extremely irresponsible is, as we just talked about, how printing money out of thin air. I mean, we are currently the banker, and the banker always wins. And if we default as the banker, then our money becomes nothing.
Yeah.
And therefore,
Jatovy and Nick.
But when they print money out of air, Jatovy, they've seen the result. When you print money out of air, you incur inflation. So you're not going anywhere, just spinning your bloody wheels.
So
if y'all are talking about we're only approving money that was already approved in the previous budget, then what are we talking about? Because if they approved the previous budget, they knew they were going to have this debt problem when the end of the year came. This was built in to the previous budget. Am I wrong?
Yeah, it was built in. They're throwing what is known as a hissy fit.
So here's the issue. I mean, you have.
Let me hear the guess for a minute, please.
One of the main issues you have is you're raising taxes without raising taxes. Inflation is a hidden tax on the average person. And if you're smart and if you've got a lot of money and you buy hard assets, this inflation by printing all this money doesn't harm you, but it does harm the average American, because the average American loses their purchasing power when we print money. And that's the dangerous thing here. They're raising taxes by printing this money. I don't think we have a choice.
It's worse than that, though, Gary. That what happens is when inflation takes place and they raise your salary and they raise the amount of income you have, you're pushed into successfully higher income tax brackets. So not only does your purchasing power go down because of inflation, it goes down further because you accidentally get pushed into higher brackets. It's the same problem we're seeing in real estate right now. In North Carolina, they said, we need to raise the real estate taxes. Well, not really, because real estate values have gone up. If they just would assess them at fair market value, they wouldn't have to raise the millage rate. It's ridiculous because your values of your property go up, and because of that, your tax bill is going up. So what we're seeing is, and this is the fraud that Congress and our politicians play on the American public, that when inflation takes place, you get a double wallop. One is you're going to get less for your money. Number two, your taxes do go up because you're going to find out you're going to be a higher tax bracket, and your real estate taxes are going to go up because the value of the property goes up. So it's kind of it's a lose-lose situation for the American public, but it's totally irresponsible for them to do this now. What they should do it is I agree with Jatovy, during the appropriations process. They have another budget coming up that's due in October. If you want to slam that, Republicans, but please don't.
Nick, have we ever had a budget that was approved that went down, made smaller than the previous year? Does the government ever not grow?
Very rarely that takes place, okay? But the last person who balanced the budget was a gentleman by the name of Bill Clinton, who was a Democrat. The person before that was Richard Nixon, a Republican. Two people that are very controversial. But there's one thing you have to agree on. They both balanced the budget. And that's the last time. The irresponsible...
No, I'm sorry. I didn't say balance the budget. I meant decrease the budget, which is separate from balancing.
No. In terms of decreasing, I haven't seen any decreasing of the budget. And there could be a danger actually in decreasing the budget. If they decrease the budget, balance the budget may be okay, but decreasing the budget, you may actually send the United States into a depression. The last guy who was interested in that was a gentleman by the name of Herbert Hoover, who believed in fiscal responsibility, tighten the money supply so huge that we basically faced a depression for many years. And so
Lee,
there is an optimal number in
Are you-
terms of the budget. And this is where I agree with the Honorable David M. Walker, who's
Are
been
you-
on our show every Monday. I'm going to make a plug for Economics Monday with the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, is on the Pod TV network every Monday. And he believes in two words: fiscal responsibility. There is a
Are you-
correct number of debt to GDP. And right now, our debt is getting over the 100% limit of the GDP.
Lee, are you asking in terms of, lowering the deficit in terms of the amount of spending, in terms of cutting spending? Is that I'm confused by your question.
Yeah, I think we all agree there's some waste in government. It's not 100% efficient. There's at least some waste in government. So theoretically, we could decrease what the current year's spending or any year's spending, separate from the overall deficit.
That is correct.
We don't have to increase it every year just because.
Lee, and our biggest budget item is the national defense. So would you want to lower the amount that we're spending on national defense? And argumentatively, we spend 10 times more than Russia on national defense. Would that be
if some of that is way 100%? Just because, I believe we should have zero-based budgeting. The way we budget is ridiculous. You get what you had last year plus. You should have to justify every nickel that you spend. Just because you spent it before doesn't mean you should get it again, including military.
Okay. Well, we're on the same page on that. I don't think that the golden goose needs to.
I think the reason why we spend so much on the national defense, and it goes back to my first comment, which was it's to maintain the U.S. as the reserve currency. That's why we're able to do it right now. If we didn't spend all that money on national defense, we wouldn't be the reserve currency. And so anybody else who does a technological leap that gets beyond our military capacity, they will have the reserve currency going forward. So if we develop hypersonic AI weapons or somebody does that, they will then have the technological leap and they will have the reserve currency. Are
you saying we should spend money on military that we don't need because we have this other alternative purpose?
No, but I'm telling you that's what the purpose is. It's not because we're trying to bring democracy to all these countries. I think that the reason why we're spending the money is because that's the arm, that's our force in the United States to maintain our power structure throughout the world. Okay. It's not because we're an industrial leader per se. It's because we have armed forces that are able to deploy. And that's what's maintaining our reserve status right now.
Shaquille has been quiet, which really bothers me. Either A, he's sick, or B, I don't
His
know.
mic is broken.
No, I'm here. I'm here.
Listen to him from Australia.
Well, I've been, Gurpreet's saying, good to meet you and good to have you on the show. He's pretty much saying the same sort of stuff that I've said before about the US. Whether spending money is an issue or not is something for you guys to decide domestically. But I certainly think that borrowing that money all the time is not healthy. You should be looking at an increase in taxes and taxing properly, as I said on yesterday's show. Looking at how much tax as a percentage of the GDP you want government to spend on your behalf, and then keeping government accountable to that. But when we talk about decreasing expenditure in the US, well, the US spends about 3% on defense. The US is a very important ally to many countries in the world. That's why we all consider the president to be the leader of the free world. I don't really think there should be a decrease in defense expenditure as such. Of course, Lee, there's going to be some waste there, and it's very hard to see what that waste is because the Department of Defense, and those agencies just don't want to be very transparent with what they're doing with the money. But of course, there's going to be waste in lots of different areas. But the biggest expenses in the US is Social Security and Medicare, or Social Security and healthcare. Do you guys want to see a decrease in expenditure there? I mean, most countries wouldn't want to see a decrease in those things. When you hear these arguments around the world, there is some desire amongst some people to see that people that are receiving Social Security benefits are working for it or are in training or they're doing something that's going to eventually be productive. But for the most part, if you're talking about pensioners, people who are on disability pensions or old age pensions and that sort of thing, you can't decrease their payments.
Shaquille?
So a lot of the other ways that we hear about is tree equity, where they're going to go and plant a whole heap of trees without really doing anything else to improve particular areas, or they're going to do student loan forgiveness, which I have to say to Nick, if you're saying that the government should be responsible and pay its bills, well, they seem to be pretty keen on telling university students that you don't have to pay your bills, we'll forgive it. And if you're a university student right now, why would you, even if you had the money, why would you pay your university debt? You would wait, wouldn't you? You'd wait until a subsequent government might pay it off for you. Lee?
Yeah, I made this argument yesterday. A lot of the money going into education is not going into teaching. It's going to administration. The same thing can be said for the healthcare also, or Social Security benefits. A lot of it is not going to the people. It's going to administration and to administer these things. That stuff could be done much better, much cheaper, much more efficiently, reducing maybe the overall cost, but not the cost to the average person getting their pension benefits.
So Lee, I would agree with you. And in fact, when it came to education, that was exactly the point that I made yesterday. But the thing is, let's take healthcare, we'll put it away from education. Even if you're correct, and I believe that you are, that healthcare is delivered in a very top-heavy, administrative-heavy fashion, which means that the patient's not actually getting the optimum healthcare.
100%.
Money's being spent. And we saw that in the UK. We saw that in the NHS. We've seen that all over the world. Even if that is correct, just ripping the money out of the budget isn't going to solve that problem. If you reduce the budget by 20%, you're not going to see a 20% reduction in administrative staff. You're just going to see a 20% reduction across the whole board. And actually, you see that in Australia and in Western Australia, where I'm originally from. You're seeing those sorts of issues over there. So it's not a unique problem in the United States. It's a problem everywhere. So I would say that, if you want to see more competition in the healthcare industry, then that's something that government needs to do in relation in your country to lobbying against the AMA, to saying to Big Pharma that they can't be, insisting that doctors and student doctors only learn how to prescribe medications rather than teaching about proper holistic healthcare and that sort of thing. But those are all internal political things about the structure of your healthcare system. Just saying we don't want to spend the money and so therefore we're not going to, I don't think makes a lot of sense. The last thing I'll just quickly say.
No, I agree with you. They have to figure out how to spend it more efficiently.
With government expenditure, you have had a high rate of inflation. We can debate about whose fault that is, but there is a high rate of inflation in the United States, which means that government expenditure kind of does have to go up anyway, just to support existing things. But you also have to remember that interest rates have increased really dramatically as well. And so that's going to be a question because, interest rates now are still relatively low. I mean, we've had really, really low interest rates for a long time. They're still not as high as what they were. And of course, anybody who remembers what interest rates were like in the 80s, if interest rates went anywhere near that, that's a really scary thought for a country with as much debt as the United States has. It's a very scary thought for, I think, a lot of countries around the Western world is what happens if interest rates do go that high.
I want to interject. I want to comment something on the healthcare side because I have a expertise in that. I'm actually a medical physician and I deal with that part of it. 2/3 of the U.S. healthcare budget is directly driven by diseases of obesity. And this is metabolic inflammation. This is prediabetes, diabetes, hypertension, most solid tissue tumors. 2/3 of that. We could eliminate 2/3 of that within a couple of years if we changed a few things. And part of that is how big agriculture is, monocropping and all of the things that it does. It's how big food interacts with society. And it's how our pharmaceutical industry harvests the human being, the benefits of the human being into through the healthcare expenditures. That's how they make money. So they have Part D Medicare, which covers a lot of pharmaceuticals, and all of these private insurances cover that. I agree that it's administrative heavy, but the reason why the U.S. spends so much on healthcare and has such terrible outcomes with healthcare compared to other countries is our population is fundamentally different than some of the other countries. It's not as different as Australia. Australia is similar, and they have similar issues. but it's a fundamental issue of obesity and metabolic inflammation and the secondary effects from that and all the expenses associated with it. You could eliminate 2/3 of that if we changed how people interacted with food. It's not that hard to do. I do it in my clinic every single day. We take people off of insulin. The cost of insulin per annum is about $12,000 for the average person per year. And if you can get them to reverse their type 2 diabetes by dietary intervention using a more holistic approach, it's amazing. And we do it every day.
Where are we failing? Is that our educational system?
Quick question.
Can I just say something back to you about what you've just brought up with diabetes and obesity? Now, I've struggled with weight as an adult, and it was mostly because I kept eating like I was a teenager, and I couldn't do it anymore. And I used to drink. It wasn't actually what I ate. It was actually what I was drinking. I used to drink a lot of juices because I thought they were healthy. That's just what I was taught. When I did start to cut sugar out off my diet, I lost a lot of weight and I felt a lot better. But I just want to actually say, Dr. Robert Lustig, I think is how his name is pronounced, so I'm sure you're familiar with. He's written some very interesting books. And in one of the books he wrote, and I actually had to go and look it up to verify the information, he talked about a doctor in Australia who thought that his patient was on far too many medications and took the patient off the medications, changed the patient's diet. And there was a complaint made to the AHPRA, which is essentially the AMA, but in Australia. And he lost his license for inappropriately curing his patient. And that really, because I have a lot of family that are in medicine, and I started looking at what's actually going on in the medical field. And that's what I was referring to when I said that the AMA is often just acting as a lobby group, not actually for doctors to be able to practice medicine in a way that would actually be the healthiest for the patients. But the AMA gets a lot of funding from pharmaceuticals, and they want you to be prescribing medications rather than doing what it sounds like what you're doing, which is to change patients' diets. I've got a very good friend of mine who's a doctor in Beverly Hills who was telling me about them wanting to set up a doctor's-owned medical practice. I can't remember what state it was that he was talking about, and they weren't allowed to do it. But, if I want to do it as a person in finance, no problems. But the doctors weren't allowed to do it because of some, regulation or law that they had. And that's the sort of thing that I think holds back the United States. And just lastly on that point, the US, they're very quick to say they spend double the amount that, your Western peer groups do on healthcare, which is true. You spend around 18 to 20% of your GDP. Most other countries are sitting, somewhere between 8 and 12%. But you also have half the doctors per population, per capita, as what most other countries have. So, the fact that there's half the doctors per population and double the cost, I mean, it's not a hard leap to find out why some of these costs are there. Now, why are there so few doctors? Well, because medical schools have been paid hundreds of millions of dollars by the AMA to artificially keep low the amount of medical student places that are available to students in America. So, all of these things are going to add to the cost. And I think to come back to the budget question, I don't think that just trying to reduce the budget in that area would actually solve these issues because it's a structural problem.
But it's a big problem with 20% of our GDP going to healthcare cost. There's a great book called Sickening. I thought this is pretty good by Dr. Abramson. It's actually been on our network before. I think with the hearings in Congress, and I know they were doing the January 6th hearings, there should be hearings on healthcare every day. I mean, this is 20% of our GDP.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hey, Nick, just really quickly and everything, because I've been having technical problems, but I've got those solved and everything. So I don't know if we've had a chance to actually learn more about Mr. Potter and his background, but I definitely wanted him to have that opportunity. But I also had a quick question because yesterday I was on another podcast and they were talking about housing in New York and all in that space. And the gentleman I was talking to was actually a corporate buyer. So he was buying like those big corporate buildings and all in that space. And he was saying that the issue that they are having right now is that a lot of those buildings are empty because a lot of people don't want to return to work. So they're trying to figure out what to do with them. And that is becoming a investment nightmare. Particular gentleman that I met yesterday and all in that space because there's all these empty spaces that are sitting in New York City that are not being maximized and all along those lines. But I was just wondering if Mr. Potter could share a little bit about his also if he has any thoughts on that.
Mark, before you change the subject, Toby wanted to say something about the healthcare question that we were talking about. So,
because I think Mr. Potter brought up the big fact about our obesity in our nation, and I think one of the presidents, well, actually it was President Obama who came in with the mindset around the American Healthcare Act and all the other stuff, trying to deal with that. In Mr. Potter, in your mind, how did we, ignore the message that he had brought in at that time?
Well, it's because the incentives. There's no incentive. Incentives drive everything. And the reality is, like, if you forgive student loans, there's no incentive for the universities to drop their charges, because they can get more money from the students who are not ultimately responsible for the bill. That's why tuition keeps going up, and numbers of administrators compared to number of students, the administrators keep increasing, and you don't get a better output. In healthcare, the incentive is driven to increase the amount of expenditure of pharmaceuticals and hospitals, and there's no incentive to reduce it. If there was an incentive that said, "Hey, Dr. Pata, you took 5,000 patients and you took them off of insulin. It saved us $12,000 a patient. You just saved us $20-30 million. We're going to give you 3% of what you saved." Don't you think that every physician in the United States would suddenly go, "I can really make a difference. I've got an incentive to change"? But you don't have that. The incentive right now is not to do that. The incentive is and so there's something called a HEDA score. A HEDA score documents the severity of disease in a particular patient. The higher the HEDA score, the higher the reimbursement for an HMO to give to a physician. The incentive is not for the patient to get better. The incentive is to identify all their medical problems. And the more medical problems you have, the more there is for payment. And so our incentives are misaligned, and that's a fundamental problem. And the incentive of the big agriculture company is to use everything that they can that's subsidized and then feed it to the American public and make the delta on it. The largest recipient of food aid in the United States right now, I think, is Walmart, because they sell sugar sweetened beverages. They sell soda, and it's through the high fructose corn syrup that they get that. So, I mean, it's incentive disalignment that we have to fix. And once we fix that,
sorry, just one quick question, a follow up. But using that example, the 3%, doesn't that sometimes incentivize the doctors to reduce costs where inappropriately reduce care to patients because they benefit personally?
Absolutely, it would. And that's why you have to have the appropriate punishment on the other side. You can't have a unilateral, "Oh, you're going to get X percentage." Right now, we have a unilateral, you get more money if the patient is sicker. We got nothing on the other side. Everything has to be within a balance, and the incentive has to be both positive and negative. Right now, there's no incentive to make people healthier as in terms of fundamental.
It's stupid. It's a crime.
There's not something separate. We need to fix that. That's a major issue.
And Mr. Potter, I know one of the other things that we talked about when I ran across you on social media, and it's actually two of Nick's favorite topics, is you actually talk about the intersection and how fiscal literacy and the violence that is going on around our country are connected. Could you go into that and explain that a little bit? Because I know that when we ran across each other, it might have been Clubhouse or one of those things. That was one of the things that you discussed and all along those lines. But I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because even when I reached out to you, I said I would probably be bringing this up because this is definitely a intersection that I think doctors are aware of but don't always address.
Hold on. So just repeat for me, because I missed this. The financial literacy and which component?
Of balance.
I'm sorry, I can't hear that.
Valence.
Valence.
It's just valence.
Valence.
Like gun violence.
Oh, violence. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I was like, hold on. I'm sorry about that. I was having a tough time. So what we're specifically talking about and gun violence is a major issue for the United States, in that there is no countervailing force on the other side if someone is going to participate in gun violence. The vast majority of gun ownership is perfectly appropriate, and it's the only thing that separates us from a corrupt government. If a government becomes corrupt and does something extraordinarily difficult or extraordinarily challenging for Americans, they can resort to having an armed militia if they have to, and that keeps the government in check. So that's one side of it, and it's a right in the United States. The violence component, though, is separate. So the main issue with gun violence in the U.S. is that people are allowed to get weapons that have no business having the weapons, either purchasing them initially or stealing them, or having developed a cognitive impairment that keeps them from having appropriate judgment. The vast majority of people that participate in mass shootings have major psychiatric issues, and have recently been changed on their medications or have had medications added that seem to increase their risk tolerance for extraordinarily dangerous activity and increase their suicidality. And so the issue is, my feeling is the issue on the gun violence side, certainly there's a criminal element. So if you're dealing drugs and you need to protect yourself from other drug dealers, you're going to have a weapon that allows you to have asymmetric force, a leverage point, so that you can hit the other person without injuring yourself. But I think the gun violence you're talking about is the mass shooting gun violence, which is an issue of psychiatric, and which is an issue of somebody obtaining a weapon that they should never have had in the first place, or they've developed psychiatric dysfunction. And as in terms of financial literacy,
can I just ask you? Sorry, about the mental health issue there. So,
yeah.
Would you be suggesting then that if somebody has a mental health issue, sometimes these mental health issues are temporary? Perhaps somebody's having a crisis in life; they've become extremely depressed, something like that, and they start taking medications that they should no longer be able to have a gun.
No, I'm not saying that you should no longer be able to have a gun, but I'm saying that if you're a danger to yourself and you're put onto medication because you're a danger to yourself, then that's a problem. If you're a danger to others and you're put on a medication, that's a problem. You wouldn't want somebody who is suicidal to have a weapon. So if you show up with suicidality or if you show up with prior history of violence and you've had an interaction with law enforcement, you probably should not have a weapon. And that's
but then you run into a problem there that people who, may be feeling suicidal are going to think, well, look, I've got all these guns, and if I go and report it, that I'm having some issues, that I'm really feeling, bad, or if I go and try and get help, which is what we encourage people to do, then there's going to be some other repercussions for me. I may lose my access to the guns. I may not be able to get those guns back. I'm going to have to jump through all these things. So you're actually putting a hurdle in front of those people who would otherwise seek help, I think. And it's a big challenge to even get people to get help in the first place. And there's a relatively low percentage of them that actually do anything, that's really destructive once they've got help.
I think that unique population is the only part of the population, because you don't have somebody who is completely okay, who might have 30 guns, might have 40 guns, might have a ton of weaponry, but they're not suicidal. They're not the ones out creating havoc in society. It's the person who is schizophrenic that hears voices. It's the person that has those issues. That's, if you were to tailor a remedy, I wouldn't tailor it to the general public. I would tailor it to the unique group that is your highest risk.
What do you do with the general violence in our big cities?
But then you're sorry. I'm not trying to just push back at you. My family specifically are in basically, like my mother, for example, is a mental health nurse. So I totally understand and agree with what you're well, I totally understand what you're saying, and I agree it's somewhat with what you're saying there. But even if we take someone who's schizophrenic, who's hearing voices, things like that, if they stay on their medication, which oftentimes people don't, but if they stay on their medications, this is a disease just like any other disease. If they stay on their medications, they're normally fairly stable. If we start taking away rights, whether it be rights to guns or right to other things, right to drive a car, any other sorts of rights, we could end up punishing those people within that group that actually they might be at a higher risk, but they're not actually going to do anything. We're punishing them because a small fraction of them will actually go ahead and commit a crime.
Shaquille, I don't want to punish any of them. My issue is that we have a government in the United States that right now wants to pass measures to restrict gun ownership. And I think it's at a national level, and I think it's at a state level. And so we have to accept that we have some issues. We can certainly push back against that. I personally have 4 handguns. And I'm a very strong supporter of a well-armed militia, and I'm a very strong. I'm Sikh. I'm from North India. I mean, so
am I, allegedly, but we can't trace our family tree far back enough. So
I don't have any issues with people having weaponry. My issue is if you have somebody who's psychiatrically unstable, that's where I would focus any restriction, if any at all. I don't think that I would focus it on the general public. I think that anybody should be allowed to get appropriate weaponry as long as they're of consenting age and they can go buy it. And I don't have any restriction issues there. My issue is on the mental.
Just pursuing that line of thought though. If a suitably qualified medical practitioner, mental health practitioner deems somebody to be at really high risk, what would you propose then would be the process? Is it going to be a medical decision that the person would temporarily or permanently have their gun ownership rights impaired, or would that be a legal process? If it's a legal process, what's the criteria that they would have to legislate to make that happen? Because otherwise, potentially, people doctor shop when they're looking for medications. Potentially people are going to say, hang on a second, I'm not sure this doctor's going to do what I want. I want to go see a different doctor who's going to give me a different assessment. How would this play out, do you think?
I personally think that it's slippery slope. I mean, the thing is, once you start down that slope, anybody can out somebody and say, oh, that person threatened me. And then you get entangled into that issue. There's a million people out there that might cause you difficulty in your life because they're pissed off at you. And that would be an easy way for somebody to hurt somebody who was a gun owner. So this has to have a lot of safety issues. So, but that's the only place I would place any restriction. I'm not recommending the restriction. I'm saying if there was a place to place a restriction, that's what I would look at.
My question would be, what is the harm done with what you're talking about with a mental health screen or a red flag law or something like that? If, for example, an individual does have that could be a danger to somebody or could be a danger to themselves, what is the harm done by not allowing that individual access to an item that's specifically designed to kill? So my confusion in this whole conversation at this point is, what's the harm done by restricting that individual?
He's losing his Second Amendment rights for that period of time.
But
whether it's self-defense, whether it's hunting, whether it's target practice.
My question is, because right now gun violence is is really high in our country. Gun violence is the #1 killer of young kids at this point. What is the harm done trying to restrict access to an individual who could be a danger to society?
By whose definition? That's my problem.
That's the thing, Jacoby. It's who's going to make that determination, and certainly, you've got a Fourth Amendment right in the United States. So, does somebody say, well, I think that John Smith is going to be a problem because of the following reasons? And they're like, what's the process then to suspend that person's Second Amendment rights or any other right for that matter?
Do they get them back?
We're hanging on to something that was drafted in like the
Yeah.
17th century.
Okay, but
You
Nick,
talking about First Amendment?
if you want to change, Nick, if you want to change the Second Amendment, there's a process for doing that, right? You guys changed your 18th Amendment, had it reversed in the 21st Amendment.
right.
If you want to change your amendments, then do so. But what you're trying to do is you're trying to get around it with state laws or federal laws without actually having a constitutional amendment change. That's not the process.
That's what I'm saying. You have to get rid of that stupid amendment. It was drafted.
But that's not the question. That's not the debate right now.
Before we get into the legal debate of it, not even thinking about the law, and Lee, this will go back to the conversation that we had. Can we agree here on this panel that if somebody is deemed a danger by a medical professional, even by the law enforcement, can we agree that a criminal who has abused his wife should not have access to a weapon that is specifically
Jacoby? I think we could agree more, me and you, if we can have objective measurements, not subjective.
But it's not subjective. If they've beaten their wife,
not subjective. If you got a person who is convicted of a felony,
so I'm just saying, can we agree to that?
Right, yeah. I get that. But my question also is, what if that felony has nothing to do with violence? It's a white collar crime.
I'm just saying, can we agree on that part? If they,
I wouldn't agree with that. I'm not American, but if I was, I wouldn't agree with that at all. We, for example, have very strict gun laws in Australia, as you guys know.
They do, and they have a lot of violent crime in Australia. Right. You know that.
No. Nobody has as high a rate in the United States. You guys are amongst the highest in the world. But that's besides in the Western world. But that's besides the point. I'll tell you why I'd have a problem with that, Jacoby. If two guys go to a bar and they get drunk and they get into a punch-up, and they fight with each other, and one of them breaks the other one's jaw, okay, or breaks the other one's arm or something, and he ends up being charged with a felony, convicted of a felony. 10 years later, should that person still not be able to own a gun because he did something drunken and stupid when he was 22 years old? I don't think that makes any sense at all.
Had a gun at the same time and could have killed him at that moment.
My point is, Toby, hold on one second.
I was just going to say, if we cannot argue that about a law-abiding gun owner, if we can't even agree that criminals should not have guns, because now you're already stating that criminals can have guns. So then, if everybody has a gun, a fact of the matter is more guns equals more gun violence. That's proven by the U.S. because we lead in gun violence and all the gun stuff. But
Switzerland has a higher.
Away from criminals,
I don't think that you can create.
Switzerland has a higher gun ownership rate per capita than what the United States has. Yeah. Their gun violence rates are nowhere near what the United States has.
How are their laws on? Do they have stricter gun laws?
No, I don't believe that they do. And actually, I was really surprised last time I was in Zurich. Not the last time, the first I went to Zurich. I went to this really fancy restaurant, and right next door to the restaurant was this massive gun store that was closed, and the guns and big knives and things like that were actually in the window display that you could see, and you could just walk in and show you that you're a citizen and buy the gun, was my understanding of it. But the thing that I want to talk about with felonies is we know there's a lot of disparities within the justice system in the United States, and I don't want to see people get punished forever for a crime that they committed when they were younger because they're deemed a felon forever.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Hey, Mr. Potter, really quickly, because I did say that when I reached out to you that I was going to bring up another issue that we have talked about here on this network and everything, and we brought it up a couple of times, and you've actually have some studies and some ideas around this, and it's a controversial topic, but I was wondering if you could explain why in your world or in your thoughts there is a rise in transvestitism, because that was something else that I did see in your talking points that you were willing to talk about, and I was just curious if you could talk about that as well, because I did see that is something that you have mentioned.
Just to point out real quick, because the gun laws actually in Switzerland are a little bit you supposed to have a criminal-free record to get a gun, but you're also must be deemed unlikely to cause harm to others in Switzerland. So the gun laws actually are stricter in Switzerland than they are in the U.S.
Well, yeah, but Toby, anybody can pretty much go to a gun show, right, and get a gun. So, you know,
that's not in Switzerland.
That's not Switzerland, but switching back, Mr. Potter, on that.
Yeah.
So you're specifically referring to transgenderism or
Right.
Or gender fluidity. We have an all-time, and this is from a lecture series that I did with Low Carb USA. We do have a dramatic increase in our number of people who are self-identifying with alternatives to their biologic original sex that's DNA based, and it's my opinion personally that because of the rapid rise that's happened, if you look generation over generation over generation, we're at about the point where it used to be about 6% of the population was gender fluid or had some sort of misidentification of gender, or they weren't the gender that they were born. It was about 6%, but it's gotten up to almost 50% very, very rapidly in the youngest generation. And I think one of the factors that we're ignoring as a population is that it has to do with biologic factors that are environmental. And so there's something called the anogenital distance, which is the distance between the anus and the scrotum. And the shorter that gets, the higher the in utero estrogen exposure there was to that fetus. And so they've measured anogenital distances, even in polar bears, who are apex predators, that have nothing to do, that don't watch social media. And their anogenital distance is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. It's my opinion, based upon what I've found, is that this is a response from the environmental estrogens that we're seeing, which are seen in plastics. A lot of our plastics that we're getting exposed to are being transmitted over to the fetus, and even parts per billion of estrogenic material that the fetus sees. What happens is females become more masculine and males become more feminine. And I think that that's part of it. Certainly there's a social component of it. Certainly there's a social issue associated with this that makes it more likely that this will occur. But I think underneath that is kids are confused. And you're going to see more of this because of the changes in estrogen.
When you talk about estrogen, what about the extremely, to me, the extremely alarming drop in testosterone that we're seeing really around the world, and we're also beginning to see it in our animals?
Yeah.
Is that playing a really important part here as well?
It's directly correlative. So if I take a male, and to give you a xenoestrogen example, which has to do with obesity, actually, most visceral fat, the fat that you get in your belly, releases xenoestrogens. And if you're a male and your body sees these xenoestrogens, it immediately suppresses your luteinizing hormone, which causes testosterone release. So if you have a belly full of fat, visceral fat, you're going to get xenoestrogens and you're going to drop your testosterone production. The same thing happens if you feed animals vegetable oil and they get visceral obesity. It's the exact same thing. And then if you get in utero estrogen exposure, you get the same thing. If you're a frog and you're exposed to environmental factors that are estrogenic, then you may have both genders. And so I think that these
would dosing patients with extremely low levels of testosterone, extremely high levels of estrogen, with testosterone, giving them a dose of testosterone, would that have any, is there any sort of clinical potential there? Is there any sort of potential for that to solve some of this issue?
I don't think anybody's studied that, but one of the things, so this brings in another problem. And so if you take a human population like the United States and you look at their sperm volume and their sperm count, we've steadily dropped our sperm count to the point where we almost don't have enough sperm in the average American to reproduce. There's a certain number of sperm per milliliter that you have to have. We used to have like 70 to 90. I'll have to look up the exact reference again. We used to have 70 to 90 million sperm per milliliter, and we're down to 30 to 35 million sperm per milliliter in the last 15 to 20 years. What that does is it creates an artificial pressure of decreased reproduction. And as you decrease your reproduction, then that population collapse occurs. And already we've gone from number of children born per woman in the United States, which used to be about 2.4 to 2.6, and we're now down to below what it takes to reproduce enough people to maintain the population. That's what China already did. They're depopulating right now. The US, but for illegal immigration, would be depopulated. That's our biggest threat. Once we depopulate, we're in trouble because we don't have the economic drivers to maintain this country as we depopulate. And any country that doesn't have incoming immigration, like Japan or China, that does not have household formation and production of children, is going to depopulate. We have, for positive or negative sake, we have a huge incoming population, a migration, which most of it's illegal. That's what's maintaining the U.S. population. And internally, we've gotten rid of our testosterone. We just don't reproduce.
Mr. Potter, I know we're winding down everything.
I'm sorry, what's happening in those countries that these people are coming to the United States from? Are they imploding?
Are they imploding? No.
Yeah.
Because their population. So poorer countries have higher reproduction
Birth rates.
Very high reproduction birth rates. And Nigeria is one of the highest. China is obviously net negative. India is still positive till about 2035 to 2065, and then it'll shift. The only countries, there'll be a handful of countries, and most of them will be in Africa, that will still have population growth. I think we've already seen the highest population of humans that will ever exist. We've seen it already. The next 100 years will be a decline in human population on Earth.
The statistics at the moment are projected to peak at 9 billion, and I think you're absolutely right, because I see, I'm in Africa at the moment, and the Africans are very family oriented people. They're a lot poorer than what we are, but they're very family oriented. They don't go for the sort of the LGBTQ stuff. They don't understand it. They just don't understand the argument. You don't see a lot of that over here, and you're seeing people have children relatively young, which is sort of the ideal that we were supposed to have in the West, that we've lost over certainly over my lifetime, we've lost.
Yeah, that depopulation is going to be a massive issue. I think the other thing is economic. As people increase their economic footprint, which has happened every time, you decrease the reproductive potential, and people don't want to have kids because they want to maintain the economics for the adults.
I know
you mentioned the economics playing a factor. Does religion play a factor also? People of faith, families of faith, having more children than not, secular?
I think that it plays a factor, but not enough to maintain the population. I mean, people that are extremely religious that are trying to propagate on Earth and have large numbers of kids. In fact, there's a tax incentive to have more than 12 kids in the U.S. But
more than 12.
Yeah,
more than 12 kids.
there's some tax incentive that you don't have to pay federal tax if you have above a certain number of children. I think
I'm coming over and I'm going to have 12 kids. I get out of the U.S. tax code. Brilliant.
But there are financial incentives, but not even. But those aren't sufficient to justify in people's minds the economic ramifications for it. Again, there's no incentive to have more kids right now. And so if you change people's incentives,
before the show ends, I'd like to ask you. I heard you say before about Low Carb America. Do you have books? Do you have a website? I think I can talk for all the panelists here that I would love to have you back. Do you have any books that you've written? Is there any websites that you have online that we can go to our audience and go to find out more about what you do?
Yeah, the easiest way to reach out to me is through LinkedIn, but I would go to reversediabetes.md, www.reversediabetes.md. I've just, I've had some books published as well that are interesting. But that's where I'd go to. That's the easiest way to get to me. There's a book that was just published. It's called Next Level Your Life. I'm one of the co-authors. We hit it's an Amazon bestseller. We hit 41 categories bestseller. And it kind of goes through some of the things we talked about today. It talks about the economics of life. But reversediabetes.md is an easy way to reach out to me.
We haven't heard from Sasha yet about the war in Ukraine. So Sasha, if you can give us an update, what's going on the other side of the world from Canada, of course.
Thank you for asking. There's a bit controversies happening now as Ukrainian is ready for decisive advance. There's a concern that they're going to use US or NATO-made weapons. And it was specifically stipulated that Ukraine should not use Western weapons on the Russian territory. That's a highly controversial thing, because let's see, if you take a drone attack on Moscow in recent days, what makes anybody believe that it were Western-made drones or Ukrainian-made drones or maybe Philippines-made drones or maybe Australian-made drones? How you are going to stipulate that? How are you going to find out about that? And do you need to find out about it? What makes a difference? So if that drone makes in Philippines and another one in Australia and another one in US, all three hit targets. Okay, that's fine. So those two from Philippines and Australia is fine. Please continue to do so. On those that made in US, no, you are not authorized to use those. So use Australian and Philippines drones, but don't use US. It just doesn't make any sense.
But we are part of the West. We are part of the Western Australia. Thank you very much, Sasha. But I get your point. So basically, what they would be allowed to use Chinese-made drones, but they wouldn't be allowed to use US-made drones. Is that basically what the argument is?
Well, what if it's Australian drones are made in Philippines? Would that be allowed to use or not?
Yeah.
This is
that's
really funny. So,
and also, what happens if it is? We'll just go back to America. So it's an American-made drone that was sold to Taiwan, but Taiwan has now sold it to the Ukraine. What, they're not supposed to use it? That seems really silly.
Yeah, you have to investigate. You know, one very interesting justification of what Ukrainians did, even though I believe Ukrainians actually denying it all that they did anything to do with drones. So it's probably Australia, it's probably Philippines, maybe some other countries, Iceland, maybe, who knows? Nobody knows, Morocco, maybe. So now there is very interesting justification is that these drones actually, they were hitting the so-called Rublyovka. This is the richest place in Moscow. It's very close to Moscow, but it's a region. Maybe I've been there. It's probably 20 kilometers away from the ring road in Moscow. And what's interesting about Rublyovka, that all the dignified people like Minister Shoigu, even Putin's residence, summer residence, and many other structures, they are all located there. So what Ukrainians saying is that we will not allow ourselves to attack the purely civilian people, civilian structures. However, these people, like starting with Putin and others, they are the decision makers. They all have to be brought to justice, and failing that is, excuse me, killed. Killed. So now they're going even further. Around Moscow, there are a lot of military places that actually making even the same drones, and they're making missiles and engines and so on. So what they're saying is that anybody who is involved in production of missiles and any other ammunition that can hit Ukrainians has to be liquidated, killed, or whatever you want to call it. So that that includes people who are not even working on assembly line. They include people who design the system, people who provide blueprints of the system, people who even guard this so-called businesses or enterprises or whatever. So anybody has to do with that is a legitimate military aim for Ukrainians, has to be liquidated and killed, the way I understand it. Okay, that's what's happening there.
Shaquille, I know we're getting ready to end, but I did have a quick question for you. Have you been following it all? Because I just saw it yesterday. This whole case and
I'm sorry, you're actually breaking up on my end, Mark. I'm not sure if it's your end or mine.
Mine also, Shaquille.
Okay. I was asking whether you had been hearing it all about the defamation case there in Australia and everything, and if you've been following that case, and maybe we can talk about it on.
I haven't seen the defamation case between who and who in Australia.
Ben Robert Smith. He was a decorated soldier.
That's an old case. That's been something that's been going on for quite some time. I think what probably opened the door for this was that Rebel Wilson had a defamation case that was successful, and in Australia, defamation cases are extremely difficult to win. So that's probably created the climate for that to happen. But yeah, I don't know what the latest developments are with that at the moment.
Yeah, I was just curious because I saw it appear in the news, in the world news, that I had not seen it. I did know that was an old case, but it seems to be coming back. And
yeah, it's an ongoing issue, and there's a couple of high-profile cases in Australia which I think will end up in the defamation courts. But I think we're over our allocated time, so we should probably wrap up.
Mark disappeared.
Anyway, you're all welcome to Financial Shows that we have at 1 o'clock. And we will discuss how this House voting reflects on the stocks today. That's a very.
If you want to send me a link, Sasha, I might have time today. I do have a couple of meetings to go to, but I might have time later.
Also, interestingly enough, we will discuss today so-called efficient market theory. Do you believe in that oxymoron?
I don't at all. I don't believe that at all, and I think random walk is a bit overstated. But I've never believed in efficient market theory. If it was efficient, there'd be no profit to be made. So, yeah.
Okay, we'll have interesting discussion hopefully. Okay. Thank you. I'll send you.
See you guys tomorrow. Take care.
See you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.